The stadium was alive. Alive in a way only a Michael Jackson concert could make it. Vibrating, humming, exploding with anticipation. 50,000 people packed shoulder to shoulder beneath a dome of lights and thunderous sound, their collective heartbeats sinking to the snare drum pounding from the stage. The band had just kicked into the iconic bass line of Billie Jean, the cue that always sent the crowd into a frenzy. Fans screamed so loud the air itself seemed to tremble. Camera flashes cracked across the arena like lightning, catching glimpses of glitter jackets, sequin gloves, and faces shining with sweat and tears. Michael was there at the center of it all, a single silhouette backlit by white fire, frozen in a classic stance. Fedora tilted low, sequin jacket shimmering, one gloved hand raised like a conductor about to unleash an orchestra. The anticipation was unbearable. The audience surged forward, a wave of outstretched hands reaching for him, waiting for that first sharp kick, that moonwalk glide, the voice that had defined an era. And then everything stopped. It wasn't gradual. It wasn't a flicker. It was annihilation. The spotlights died mid-beam. The thundering bass line was cut in half, strings and drums collapsing into nothing. The massive video screens blanked out in an instant. One moment the stadium was a cathedral of light and sound. The next it was a cavern swallowed by silence. 50,000 screams turned into 50,000 gasps. At first, people thought it was part of the show. Michael was known for his surprises. Maybe this was a dramatic pause before the explosion of fireworks, a stunt to heighten the drama. Fans craned their necks, waiting for the comeback burst. Some even cheered louder, expecting a new spectacle. But the darkness lingered, heavy and unbroken. Seconds stretched, long enough for unease to creep in. Up in the nosebleeds, a child clutched her mother's arm. In the front rows, celebrities shifted in their seats, frowning. Technicians backstage were already shouting over each other, the red lights of dead equipment glowing like warning beacons. For the sound engineers, it was a nightmare they whispered about but never believed would happen. Total catastrophic failure. On stage, Michael stood still, his silhouette barely visible in the pale moonlight leaking through the roof of the stadium. The sequins of his jacket caught faint glimmers, but no longer blazed. For the first time all night, he was silent, not by choice but by force. The audience murmured, a rising tide of confusion. Some fans cupped their hands to their mouths. What's happening? Is it over? Others began chanting his name. Michael, Michael, trying to summon him back to life, as though their voices could replace the dead amplifiers. Security guards hustled along the aisles, whispering into radios that weren't transmitting. Photographers lowered their cameras, realizing there was no light to capture. Michael inhaled slowly. He could hear his own breath in the silence. Something almost alien at a show like this. For years, he had been surrounded by the roar of fans, the boom of pyrotechnics, the steady pulse of in-ear monitors. Now all of it was gone, stripped away in a single moment. He took a step forward. The wooden boards beneath his shoes creaked, audible all the way to the second row. A sound so small it felt monumental in the silence. His fedora tilted slightly downward, but his eyes swept the crowd, the flickering lighters already being raised, small flames dancing in the dark. In those flames, he saw what mattered, the faces. 50,000 of them, waiting, restless, desperate. Backstage, the chaos was total. Engineers yanked open panels, wires sparking faintly. A foreman cursed under his breath. It's not just the mains, it's the backup too. Everything's dead. Sweat beaded on his forehead. This was the kind of failure that could ruin reputations, cost millions, end careers. They had no timeline, no fix in sight. On stage, Michael understood the truth faster than any technician. If he walked off, if he left them waiting for minutes or hours, the night would shatter into disaster. The headlines would be brutal. Jackson concert collapse, fans left in the dark. Refunds would be demanded. The magic he had built in the opening half of the show would dissolve into bitterness. But standing there, with nothing but silence around him, he also felt something else, something he hadn't felt in decades. Vulnerability. The same raw silence he'd faced as a boy singing in church halls without microphones, relying only on his lungs, his rhythm, and the sway of the congregation. That memory, unbidden and sharp, hit him with unexpected clarity. He raised his hand. The glove, faintly luminous even in near darkness, rose like a beacon. The crowd hushed itself, instinctively falling silent. 50,000 people hung on the smallest gesture, the lift of a wrist, the stillness of a pose. Michael held it there, steady, commanding, until the murmur of confusion melted into an almost reverent hush. The silence, once terrifying, now belonged to him. He could feel it, the collective heartbeat of the audience. In that split second, he realized the show wasn't dead, the power wasn't gone. The stage was still alive, if he had the courage to claim it. Michael snapped his fingers. Once, sharp, crisp, the sound cracked through the stillness like a whip. And then, with the smallest of smirks curling across his lips, he began to clap, a slow, steady rhythm, hands striking together, deliberate, resonant in the vast dome. The sound echoed, amplified not by speakers, but by the sheer stillness of the crowd around him. It was enough. Row by row, section by section, the audience picked it up, at first timidly, then stronger, until the stadium reverberated with 50,000 clapping hands. A rhythm older than any stage light, older than electricity itself. Primitive, human, unstoppable. Michael's silhouette shifted, his body beginning to move with the beat, hips rolling, shoulders snapping in time. He didn't need music. He was the music. The blackout had taken away the show, but in that moment, he began to give him something else. Magic born not of machines, but of silence and presence. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to support the channel. The rhythm of 50,000 clapping hands rolled like thunder through the stadium. At first it was messy, uneven, but soon it aligned into a heartbeat. Boom, boom, boom. Michael felt it vibrate through the soles of his shoes. He closed his eyes for a second and let it wash over him, a living reminder that he wasn't standing alone in the dark. But the moment was fragile. Backstage, chaos had no rhythm. Technicians were yelling over each other, flashlights darting across dead consoles. The backup generators hadn't just failed, they hadn't even kicked in. The entire system was fried. One engineer ripped off his headset and hurled it to the floor, the plastic shattering. We've lost everything. Everything. Another frantically tried patching a secondary line. Sparks spit from the cable, illuminating his pale, panicked face. He knew the weight of what hung in the balance. This wasn't just a concert. This was Michael Jackson, the man whose tours grossed hundreds of millions, whose perfectionist standards were legendary. A blown fuse could end a roadie's career. A total blackout in front of 50,000 fans? That was career suicide. What's the timeline? The tour manager barked, his voice cracking. The answer was silence, and not the kind Michael was controlling on stage. This was the silence of men too afraid to admit they had no idea how to fix what had broken. Out front, the audience was split. Some were caught in the rhythm, clapping and chanting along with Michael. Others were restless, their patience thinning. "We paid for this," one man muttered to his wife, shaking his head. A group of teenagers near the barricade shouted for the music to come back, their voices echoing in frustration. Security staff exchanged uneasy glances. The line between magic and mutiny was razor thin. Michael saw it, even as he danced in silhouette. Even as he kept the rhythm steady, he saw the tension flickering across the crowd. A mother pulling her child closer, a man pointing at the exits, an impatient fan waving a ticket stub like it was a contract for a refund. This could spiral, fast. And that was the moment Michael's instincts, sharpened from decades on stages big and small, took over. He knew what the technicians backstage hadn't realized yet. The audience wasn't just here for sound and lights. They were here for connection. If he gave them that, they wouldn't leave. They wouldn't riot. They wouldn't even demand their money back. They would remember. He lifted his gloved hand again, stopping the clapping. 50,000 pairs of hands froze midair. The silence that followed was deafening and dangerously fragile. You could almost hear the pulse of uncertainty rising in the dark. Then he did something no one expected. He laughed. It wasn't nervous laughter. It wasn't forced. It was soft, real, contagious. It carried across the front rows and rippled outward. People saw the smile breaking across his face, the way his shoulders relaxed. Instead of fear, he gave them ease. He cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted, raw and unamplified, "Can you feel it?" The crowd roared back, the words dissolving into a wave of screams and cheers. No microphone, no speakers, yet somehow the call reached every corner of the arena. Michael grinned. He had them. Backstage, a young sound engineer, barely 24, peeked through the curtains and shook his head in disbelief. He's not waiting for us," he whispered. He's doing the show anyway." The veteran beside him groaned. "Yeah, and if this keeps working, we'll never live it down." Out in the stands, lighters sparked to life. First a dozen, then 100, then thousands. Little flames waving in the air, turning the stadium into a galaxy of trembling stars. The blackout had stolen the neon and floodlights, but the audience gave it something better, a universe they created together. Michael let the moment breathe. His voice, low but clear, drifted out over the dark. "You're beautiful tonight. All of you." Some fans cried. Others shouted his name until they were hoarse. Every word, every gesture, felt magnified in the darkness. It wasn't a performance anymore. It was communion. But inside, Michael's heart raced. He could feel the weight of 50,000 expectations pressing down on him. He thought of the headlines, the critics who had waited years for him to falter. "If I walk off now, they'll say it's over. They'll say I failed." He thought of his childhood, of singing with his brothers in cramped clubs with no sound system, his father watching like a hawk from the shadows. Back then, there was no stagecraft, no laser beams, no $1 million production. There was only his voice and whether or not it could hold a room. Could it hold a stadium? Michael took a breath and started humming. Just a single note, strong and steady. His body swayed with it, his shoulders rolling. The sound floated out into the night. At first, it was only those in front rows who caught it. The rest strained, leaning forward. But then he opened his lungs and let it out full force. "Love," he sang, a cappella, stretching the word into the night. The note was raw, unpolished, but it carried. The crowd erupted. "Love me! Love me!" The front rows began to echo, carrying the melody backward like a wave. Michael lifted both hands, guiding them like a conductor. In seconds, the stadium had become a choir. 50,000 voices filling the void technology had abandoned. Backstage, the engineers froze. One dropped his wrench. Another stopped mid-wire splice, staring at the monitors that showed nothing but darkness. "He doesn't need us," one finally muttered. "He really doesn't need us." Out front, the noise had transformed. No longer a restless murmur. It was a living force. Voices joined in a harmony no soundboard could have balanced. Michael's eyes glistened as he listened, his own voice weaving through theirs like silver thread. For years, he had been called the king of pop, the master of spectacle, the icon of perfection. But here in the dark, stripped of all the polish, he was something else. Human, vulnerable, and utterly magnetic. As the last note faded, he stood still, breathing hard, sweat dripping down his face. The crowd roared, a tidal wave of sound crashing over him. They weren't asking for refunds. They weren't asking for lights. They were asking for him. And in that moment, Michael knew the blackout wasn't the end of the show. It was the beginning of the night that would define his legend. The blackout had leveled everything. The lights, the speakers, the giant video screens that usually magnified every flick of Michael's wrist. Yet standing in the void, he felt stronger than ever. The audience wasn't scattering. They weren't rioting. They were waiting ready, holding their breath for him. Michael shifted his weight onto his heels, letting the sequin loafers tap softly against the wooden stage. Thump, thump. The sound was faint, but in the stillness it carried like a drumbeat. He leaned into it, stomping harder, layering rhythm over rhythm. Soon the crowd caught it. People began stomping along in the stands, thousands of feet pounding concrete, turning the stadium into an echo chamber of percussion. Then, with a sudden snap of his fingers, Michael cut the stomping short. The sound stopped on a dime. He froze, head tilted, one gloved finger to his lips. 50,000 people hushed instantly. He had them utterly, completely. Michael tilted his head back and released a sharp, piercing cry. No microphone, no amplification, just his raw voice, slicing through the dark like lightning. The crowd erupted in screams. The famous sound, the one they had heard 1,000 times on records and videos, now naked and unfiltered. Michael grinned, sweat rolling down his temple as he threw his arms wide. "Come on," he shouted, his voice echoing as the crowd screamed it back to him. The game had begun. He strutted to the edge of the stage, leaned forward, and sang the opening line of Billie Jean. No music, just his voice. She was more like a beauty queen. The fans closest to him shrieked, then sang the next line themselves. From a movie scene, Michael clapped his hands, pointing to the left side of the arena. "Your turn." That entire section belted the chorus back at him, ragged but loud. "Billie Jean is not my lover." He spun on his heels, pointing across to the opposite side. "Now you." 50,000 voices roared. "She's just a girl who claims that I am the one." Michael laughed, spinning in place, sweat flying from his hair. The stadium had become his choir, divided into armies of sound. He commanded them like a preacher, like a general, like a man who had just discovered that electricity was optional. Backstage, the engineers stopped working. Tools clattered to the ground. They stood shoulder to shoulder, watching through the gap in the curtain as their greatest fear became irrelevant. He's conducting them," one whispered, his throat tight, like they're part of the band. "He's not saving the show," another corrected. "He's making it better." Out in the stands, a boy on his father's shoulder screamed every word, his tiny voice lost in the ocean but carried in spirit. A teenage girl with glitter on her cheeks sobbed, clutching her friend's hand as she sang until her throat burned. Strangers who had never spoken before turned to each other, shouting lyrics together, laughing through tears. Michael wasn't just performing anymore. He was dissolving the barrier between stage and crowd. He took a step back, chest heaving, then cupped his hand around his mouth. "You sound beautiful," he shouted, "but let's see if you can do this." He dropped low, stomped twice, and launched into the chorus of Beat It. His voice cracked raw in the air. "Just beat it!" The crowd responded instantly, a tidal wave crashing back at him. "Beat it!" Michael pointed to one section. They shouted the next line. He pointed to another. They shouted the one after. Call and response, volley after volley. The stadium became a giant instrument with 50,000 strings. He strung them together, weaving their voices into music that didn't need wires or circuits. The darkness became light, not artificial, not from bulbs or lasers, but from the glow of lighters, the shine of cell phones lifted into night, and the collective fire of people realizing they were part of history. And Michael knew it. He straightened, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. His chest rose and fell with sharp breaths, but his eyes sparkled. He felt alive in a way he hadn't in years. This wasn't a choreographed show polished to perfection. This was raw, wild, dangerous, and it was working. He let the crowd quiet, raising a single hand until silence returned. Then, softly, he began to sing. "Human nature. Why?" The words floated into the night, almost a whisper. But the audience leaned forward, hanging on every syllable. He gestured with his fingers, urging them to follow. A sea of voices joined in. Tell him that it's human nature. The harmony wasn't perfect. It wasn't clean, but it was alive, imperfectly human. Tears stung Michael's eyes. He thought of all the years he had fought to control every detail of his shows, every light cue, every dance step, every decibel. Yet here, stripped bare, he was discovering something deeper. Perfection wasn't the magic. Connection was. For a moment, he simply stood there, taking it in. The sound of 50,000 people carrying his melody, their voices braided with his, lifting him higher than any stage effect ever had. He closed his eyes and thought, this is what music was always supposed to be. Backstage, the tour manager leaned against the wall, watching the scene unfold. His hands, trembling minutes earlier, now hung loose at his sides. "I don't think we should fix it," he muttered, half to himself. "Not yet." The engineer beside him nodded. "He doesn't need us tonight. They don't need us. Let him finish it this way." And on stage, Michael threw his head back, arms wide, as the crowd sang the chorus of Human Nature over and over, louder and louder, until it felt like the stadium might lift off the ground. The silence had been terrifying, but in Michael's hands, it was no longer emptiness. It was a canvas, and with nothing but rhythm, voice, and the beating hearts of his fans, he had painted it into something unforgettable. The chaos backstage finally began to slow. After nearly 45 minutes of frantic scrambling, an engineer lifted his head, sweat pouring down his temples, and shouted, "We got partial power." A cheer went up among the exhausted crew. Consoles flickered, a few indicator lights blinked back to life, and one of the massive speakers hummed faintly. Not everything was restored, but enough to put a microphone in Michael's hand again, enough to pull the show back to the script. The tour manager clapped the engineer's shoulder. "Good. Signal him. Tell him we're ready." But when Michael saw the stagehand waving from the wings, holding up a mic like a lifeline, he didn't move toward it. Instead, he tilted his head, sweat-soaked curls clinging to his forehead, and smiled. Because out there in the darkness, the audience was already singing. Why, 50,000 voices rose into the night. Tell him that it's human nature. It was rough, imperfect, uncoordinated, but it was alive in a way no sound system could have manufactured. Michael spread his arms wide, as if cradling the sound itself, then shook his head gently. He didn't need the mic. He didn't want it. He wanted this. He stepped forward again, closer to the edge of the stage, the faint light of lighters reflecting in his eyes. He pressed a hand to his chest, mouthing thank you. The fans screamed louder, their voices deafening, shaking the stadium walls. Then, softly but powerfully, he began, "I'm starting with the man in the mirror." The words floated, bare, fragile, but the crowd caught them instantly. They roared the next line. "I'm asking him to change his ways." The stadium became a living choir. Michael led them, conducting with sweeping arms, stomping his feet on the wooden stage to keep time. The boards groaned under force, his sharp rhythms echoing across the dark dome. It was no longer a concert. It was a revival. Up in the stands, a woman dropped to her knees, tears streaming down her face as she belted the lyrics. A group of young men linked arms, swaying together, their voices raw from shouting. Even the skeptical fans who had muttered about refunds earlier were now swept up, their complaints forgotten, their throats burning as they joined the choir of 50,000. Backstage, the engineers hesitated, holding the restored microphone like a cursed object. "He's not taking it," one whispered. "He doesn't want it," the tour manager admitted, awe in his voice. "He's making history right now. We'd ruin it if we forced the sound back." On stage, Michael was drenched, his black sequin jacket dark with sweat, but his energy only grew. He slid into the moonwalk, gliding across the dark stage without the benefit of spotlights. Still, the audience saw him, their lighter flames and phone screens following his every move like fireflies chasing the night. With each step, each flick of his wrist, the screams grew louder. He shouted another line, cupped his hand to his ear, and the crowd shouted it back. A sea of sound, rising and falling at a command. The blackout, once a disaster, had transformed into intimacy. Michael wasn't untouchable anymore, some distant figure magnified on jumbotrons. He was human, right there with them, vulnerable in the dark, and that vulnerability was making him larger than life. "Do you feel it?" he shouted, his voice raw but ringing true. "Yes," the stadium thundered back. Michael pounded his chest with his fist, his glove flashing faintly in the starlight. He began to chant, rhythm sharp and primal. He. The crowd echoed, he. 50,000 throats in perfect sync. The stadium itself seemed to vibrate, not from machinery but from humanity. And then came the moment no one forgot. Michael stepped to the very front of the stage, lowered to his knees, and whispered into the night, "Can you sing it for me?" The audience, as if rehearsed for this exact moment, roared into the chorus of Man in the Mirror. Their voices shook the rafters. It was messy, it was imperfect, and it was glorious. Michael bowed his head, letting the sound wash over him. His chest heaved with emotion, his eyes glistening. In that moment, he wasn't the king of pop commanding his subjects. He was one of them, a man surrounded by voices, lifted by them, carried higher than any lighting rig could ever raise him. Backstage, hardened roadies who had seen 1,000 shows stood in silence, goosebumps prickling their arms. One muttered, This is church." The crowd didn't just sing, they lived the song. They screamed it, they cried it, they stomped their feet until the stands shook, until the concrete itself seemed to pulse with their conviction. And Michael, standing in the middle of it, knew the truth. He hadn't lost his show. He'd found something greater. For years, he'd been defined by spectacle, fireworks, perfect choreography, cutting-edge visuals. But tonight, stripped of all of it, he had rediscovered the essence of music, connection. As the final chorus of Man in the Mirror thundered through the night, Michael didn't sing a note. He simply stood there, hand over his heart, as 50,000 voices carried the song without him. Tears slipped down his face. The audience roared them back. And when the last echo faded, when the chants dissolved into silence again, Michael whispered, so soft it could barely be heard by the front row, but somehow it carried, "Thank you." The roar that followed was the loudest yet. The final echoes of Man in the Mirror lingered in the night air like smoke after a fireworks show. The stadium, still pitch black except for thousands of lighters and phone screens, pulsed with energy, with awe, with something no one had words for yet. Michael stood motionless at center stage. His chest heaved, sweat dripping down his jaw, his sequin glove limp at his side. For nearly an hour, he had commanded the impossible. A show without power, without technology, without the machinery that usually carried his voice and framed his brilliance. But now, in the stillness, he felt no lack. The crowd roared his name again and again, "Michael, Michael, Michael." It wasn't a desperate chant from earlier in the blackout. This was reverence, gratitude, love. Fans stood on their chairs, arms stretched upward, some with tears streaming down their faces. Others embraced total strangers, bonded by the fact that they had just witnessed something that could never be repeated. Not in the same way, not even if you tried. Backstage, the engineers stood frozen, staring at their half-repaired consoles, their blinking monitors, their useless microphones. The lead technician set the mic down gently, almost ashamed to touch it. "Doesn't matter anymore," he whispered. "He doesn't need it." The tour manager rubbed his eyes, still damp with tears he'd never admit to. "We thought tonight was ruined," he said quietly. "But this is the greatest show he's ever done." And the audience seemed to know it, too. They refused to leave. Even as the final chorus ended, they stayed rooted, chanting, singing scraps of Michael's songs in the dark, unwilling to let the night slip away. Michael stepped forward, close enough to the edge of the stage that he could see the faces in the front row, their eyes glistening in the glow of lighters. He pressed his palm to his heart, then opened his arms wide, as if embracing them all. "I love you," he said, his unamplified voice hoarse but carrying, somehow, through the roar. The fans screamed back, an ocean of sound that drowned out every broken speaker. And then, in an unscripted gesture that would later be written into music history, Michael lowered himself to the floor of the stage, lying flat on his back, staring up into the night sky. He spread his arms wide, as though offering himself to silence, as though saying, "Take me as I am, no lights, no sound, no spectacle. Just me." The stadium fell into hushed silence again. 50,000 people held their breath, watching their idol motionless, bathed only in the faint glow of stars and cigarette lighters. Then, slowly, he sat up, crossed his legs, and whispered, "This is real. This is music. You are the show tonight." Tears fell freely from the fans in the first few rows. Some reached out toward him, hands trembling. Others simply cried, clutching each other, overwhelmed. Backstage, a journalist scribbled furiously in his notebook, his heart racing. He already knew the headline that would appear in the morning's paper. The night the lights went out, and Michael lit the world. The aftermath, when the lights finally flickered back to life. Nearly 2 hours after blackout began, it felt intrusive, artificial. Fans shielded their eyes, blinking against a sudden glare. For a moment, the restored power seemed almost unwelcome, like an interruption to a sacred ritual. Michael glanced at the technicians, signaling that everything was ready, that he could pick up the show where it had left off. But he only smiled, shook his head gently, and waved his gloved hand dismissively. No, he mouthed, because he understood something in his bones. The magic wasn't in the return of the machines. The magic was in what they had just lived together, raw, unfiltered, and unforgettable. He bowed deeply, his whole body folding in gratitude. The stadium erupted, the loudest cheer of the night, a sound that rattled the walls and spilled into the streets beyond. The show didn't continue. It didn't need to. The blackout had already given them more than any pyrotechnic finale ever could. The legend, in the days that followed, the world buzzed with the story. Newspapers ran headlines that framed it as both disaster and triumph. Jackson Concert Blackout becomes history-making performance. When silence became the music, fans say it was better than any stage lights. Music critics, hardened skeptics who had long dissected every detail of Michael's career, wrote with unexpected reverence. One described it as a once-in-a-lifetime communion between artist and audience, proof that the greatest instrument in the world is a human voice, and Michael had 50,000 of them at his command. Bootleg recordings of the night, captured on shaky handheld cameras, circulated among fans. Grainy footage showed Michael's silhouette against a galaxy of lighters, his raw voice shouting over the dark, the crowd roaring back like an ocean. Those tapes became treasures, replayed not for their quality, but for the feeling they carried, a reminder of the night the machines went silent and humanity sang louder. Other performers spoke about it with awe. One legendary rocker admitted in an interview, "Every one of us prays our sound system never fails." Michael proved what happens when it does. He didn't just survive it, he turned it into magic. Michael's reflection. For Michael himself, the night lingered long after the stadium emptied. In his hotel suite hours later, he sat alone by the window, the city lights twinkling beneath him. His sequin jacket lay discarded, his socks damp with sweat, but his heart still pounded with the rhythm of 50,000 voices. He replayed in his mind the silence, the stomps, the chants, the raw choir that had risen from the dark. For so long he had chased perfection. Every show rehearsed down to the millisecond, every light cue timed, every move precise. But tonight, in the chaos, he had rediscovered something he thought fame had stolen: freedom. He whispered to himself, almost in disbelief, "They didn't need the show. They just needed me." And perhaps, he realized, he had needed them even more. Eternal memory. Years later, fans still spoke of that night in hushed, reverent tones. They called it the Night of Silence or the Blackout Show. Some said it was the most intimate performance of Michael's life, despite the size of the crowd. Others said it was a moment that proved he was more than a performer. He was a phenomenon who could turn even failure into transcendence. And for those who had been there, the memory was etched into their souls. You had to feel it. One fan said years later, "It wasn't about hearing the notes perfectly. It was about realizing we were part of the music. He gave us that. He made us the band, the choir, the show. For one night, we weren't just watching Michael Jackson. We were Michael Jackson." Michael Jackson didn't need the lights. He didn't need the sound system. That night proved it. When the machines died, the magic began. If you like this story, please subscribe to support this channel.